They had 3 minutes, maybe less. German artillery crews on the Western Front in 1944 knew this with the certainty that comes from watching other batteries disappear in clouds of smoke and steel. 3 minutes from the moment their guns fired until American counter-battery fire arrived. 3 minutes to limber the guns, mount the prime movers, and get clear of the firing position. 3 minutes before the world exploded. On the morning of November 18, 1944, near the town of Geilenkirchen along the German-Dutch border, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber stood beside his unit's 10.5mm leFH-18 Howitzer and watched the forward observer signal the fire mission. His battery, part of the 344th Volksgrenadier Division, had been ordered to support a counterattack against American positions that had pushed into German territory during Operation Clipper. Weber had served in artillery since 1941. He had fought in Russia, where German guns had dominated Soviet artillery through superior optics, better fire control, and crews trained to relocate quickly after firing. He had learned the mathematics of survival on the Eastern Front. Soviet counter-battery fire was dangerous but predictable. Their response time allowed German crews to fire, displace, and survive. The Americans were different. Weber had heard the stories from crews who had faced them in Normandy, in the hedgerows, at Mortain. The Americans had artillery in quantities that seemed impossible. They had forward observers with every infantry company, calling fire missions that arrived with terrifying speed. They had something the Germans called Feuerzauber, fire magic, the ability to mass the fire of multiple batteries on a single target within minutes of a call for fire. But orders were orders. The battery had to fire. Weber's crew loaded the high-explosive round into the breech. The gun captain checked the lay, confirmed the elevation and deflection. The battery commander, standing at his post with field telephone in hand, raised his arm. 4 guns fired in sequence, their reports echoing across the German positions. The shells arced toward American lines 3 kilometers away. Weber looked at his watch. The second hand began its sweep. His crew was already moving, trained hands working to prepare the gun for displacement. In the German army, speed after firing was doctrine, drilled into every artillery crew from their first days of training. The principle was simple: fire and move. Never fire from the same position twice if you could avoid it. Never give the enemy time to plot your location and return fire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Weber knew that doctrine, developed against Soviet artillery, might not be enough against the Americans. He had heard specific accounts. A battery near St. Lo had fired a mission and been destroyed before they could displace. Another battery at Mortain had fired twice from the same position, confident in their concealment. American counter-battery fire had arrived within 4 minutes, catching half the guns still in place. The survivors said the American shells arrived in a concentrated barrage, not scattered fire but massed volleys that saturated the entire firing position. The German army's faith in its artillery had been built on 2 decades of development and 6 years of war. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, the German military had begun rearming in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Artillery development was a priority. The Reichswehr had maintained secret training programs in the Soviet Union during the 1920s, preserving artillery expertise that would inform the designs of the next war. The 10.5mm leichte Feldhaubitze 18, the light field howitzer Model 18, entered service in 1935. It was a conventional but effective design, capable of firing a 14.7 kilogram high-explosive shell to a maximum range of 10,600 meters. The gun weighed 1,980 kilograms in firing position and could be towed by a half-track or heavy truck. A well-trained crew could sustain a rate of fire of 4 to 6 rounds per minute. The leFH-18 had served throughout the war. It had supported the Blitzkrieg through Poland and France. It had fired tens of thousands of rounds on the Eastern Front. By 1944, it remained the standard divisional artillery piece, equipping the light batteries of nearly every German division. The German army had produced over 7,000 of these howitzers, and they were considered reliable, accurate, and effective within their design parameters. German artillery doctrine emphasized decentralized control and rapid displacement. Battery commanders were trained to select firing positions with multiple exit routes. Guns were positioned to allow quick limbering and movement. Forward observers were trained to call fire missions efficiently and to relocate frequently to avoid counter-battery fire. The system had worked well against opponents whose artillery was less mobile or whose counter-battery capabilities were limited. In Russia, German artillery had often dominated through superior fire control and crew training. Soviet artillery was numerous but often poorly coordinated. Soviet counter-battery fire could be heavy but was usually slow to arrive and inaccurate. German crews learned they had time after firing, often 10 to 15 minutes, to displace before Soviet return fire arrived. This created a tactical rhythm: fire a mission, immediately begin displacement, be moving within 5 to 7 minutes, be in a new position or behind cover within 10 to 12 minutes. The assumption that shaped German artillery tactics was that counter-battery fire required time for enemy observers to spot the gun flashes or sound of firing, time to calculate the position, time to relay firing data to friendly artillery, time for those guns to receive the mission, lay their weapons, load, and fire. Time for the shells to fly to the target. German doctrine assumed this process would take at least 10 minutes, usually longer. That assumption was based on experience fighting enemies whose artillery systems operated with similar constraints to Germany's own. Soviet artillery batteries received fire missions through telephone lines that were frequently cut by German raiding parties. Soviet forward observers often lacked the training or equipment to quickly calculate accurate firing data. Soviet guns, while numerous, were dispersed and required time to mass fires on a single target. The German system was built for the war Germany had been fighting since 1939. It was not built for the war Germany was fighting in November of 1944. Weber's watch showed 90 seconds since his battery had fired. The guns were unlimbered, trails lifted, ready to be hooked to the prime movers. The SDKFZ 7 half-tracks that towed the howitzers were positioned, engines running. The crews were moving with practiced efficiency, every man knowing his role. In another 60 seconds they would be moving. In 3 minutes total, they would be clear of the firing position. It should have been enough time. Against any artillery system the German army had faced in 5 years of war, it would have been enough time. But the weapons now targeting Weber's battery were not like anything the German army had faced before. The United States Army had begun the war with an artillery establishment that, on paper, seemed unremarkable. The standard divisional artillery piece was the M101 105mm Howitzer, a design that dated to 1941. But what made American artillery different was not the individual guns. It was the system those guns operated within. American artillery doctrine in World War II was built on 3 principles that, when combined, created capabilities no other army possessed. The first principle was massed fires. American doctrine called for concentrating the fire of multiple batteries, even multiple battalions, on single targets. A call for fire from a forward observer could bring down shells not just from the observer's own battalion, but from every artillery unit within range. This required communication systems and fire direction centers that could coordinate dozens of guns simultaneously. The second principle was speed. American artillery emphasized rapid response to fire missions. From the moment a forward observer called for fire to the moment shells landed on target, American doctrine aimed for times measured in minutes, not tens of minutes. This required training, equipment, and communications that prioritized speed at every step of the process. The third principle was abundance. The United States industrial base could produce artillery pieces, shells, and support equipment in quantities that seemed limitless to armies that had fought under conditions of scarcity. American divisions were authorized more artillery than German divisions. American artillery units never lacked shells. American forward observers could call fire missions without worrying about ammunition conservation. These 3 principles, massed fires, speed, and abundance, created an artillery system that was greater than the sum of its parts. A single American 105mm howitzer was not dramatically superior to a German leFH-18, but an American artillery battalion, operating within the American system, could deliver fire support that no German unit could match. The M101 105mm Howitzer, which had replaced the M2A1 by 1944, embodied the American approach. The weapon weighed 2,259 kilograms in firing position, slightly heavier than the German leFH-18. It fired a 14.97 kilogram high explosive shell, nearly identical to the German projectile weight. Its maximum range was 11,430 meters, slightly better than the German gun, but not dramatically so. The technical specifications mattered less than what surrounded them. Each M101 howitzer was part of a system designed for industrial warfare. The gun came with a fire direction center equipped with plotting boards, firing tables, and communications equipment. Forward observers carried radios that could reach battalion fire direction centers directly. Those fire direction centers could calculate firing data and transmit it to gun crews within seconds. The M101 could be brought into action quickly. The split trail design allowed the crew to drop the trails, level the weapon, and prepare to fire in under 2 minutes. The breech mechanism was simple and reliable. Loading and firing could be done rapidly by a trained crew. The weapon could sustain a rate of fire of 4 rounds per minute for extended periods, with bursts of up to 10 rounds per minute possible for short durations. But the real advantage was not in the gun itself. It was in how many of these guns the Americans could bring to bear. A standard American infantry division in 1944 included 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers, with 12 guns per battalion. That was 36 howitzers organic to the division. An armoured division had 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers in self-propelled mounts, another 36 guns. Corps artillery added additional battalions that could be attached to divisions as needed. The industrial capacity that produced these weapons was unlike anything the German military had encountered. The Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois began. Production of the M101 in 1941. By 1945, American factories had produced 10,460 M101 howitzers. This was in addition to the 4,133 M2A1 howitzers produced earlier in the war. American industry delivered over 14,000 divisional artillery pieces during the war years. Production was distributed across multiple facilities. Rock Island Arsenal was the primary producer, but other factories contributed components. The Timken Roller Bearing Company in Ohio produced the gun's carriage. The Crane Company in Illinois manufactured the recoil mechanism. Dozens of subcontractors provided smaller components. The entire industrial base was mobilized to ensure artillery production never slowed. Ammunition production dwarfed even the impressive numbers for the guns themselves. The United States produced over 258 million rounds of artillery ammunition during World War II, across all calibers. For the 105mm howitzer specifically, production exceeded 60 million rounds. This was approximately 4,200 rounds for every M101 and M2A1 howitzer produced. German production, by contrast, was constrained by resource shortages, industrial damage from Allied bombing, and competing priorities. Germany produced approximately 7,000 leFH-18 howitzers during the entire war, from 1935 to 1945. Ammunition production was limited by shortages of brass for cartridge cases and explosives for propellant and bursting charges. By 1944, German artillery units were frequently operating under ammunition restrictions, with batteries limited to a certain number of rounds per day. The disparity in production meant that American artillery crews could fire missions that would have been unthinkable in the German army. A single American battery could fire 100 rounds in a fire mission without anyone questioning the expenditure. German batteries carefully rationed their ammunition, knowing that resupply was uncertain. But production numbers alone did not explain why American counter-battery fire was so devastatingly fast. The speed came from the system that surrounded the guns, a system built on communications, training, and doctrine that prioritized rapid response. American artillery forward observers, called FOs in military parlance, were assigned to every infantry company and sometimes to individual platoons. These observers were artillery officers or trained enlisted men who accompanied the infantry into combat. They carried radio sets that provided direct communication to their battalion fire direction center. The radio equipment was reliable and had sufficient range to maintain contact even during mobile operations. When a forward observer identified a target worthy of artillery fire, he followed a standardized procedure. He would call his fire direction center, identify himself, and describe the target. The description included the type of target, its location relative to known landmarks or using map coordinates, and the urgency of the mission. A typical call might sound like fire mission, enemy artillery battery in the open, grid coordinates 523478, request battalion 3 volleys. The Fire Direction Center, located at battalion headquarters, received the call and immediately began processing the mission. Officers and enlisted specialists worked at plotting boards, large tables with maps mounted on them. They plotted the target location, calculated the range and azimuth from each battery to the target, and determined the correct propellant charge and elevation for each gun. This calculation, which might have taken tens of minutes using older methods, was accomplished in under 60 seconds by trained fire direction center personnel using standardized procedures and pre-calculated firing tables. The center transmitted firing data to each battery by radio or field telephone. A typical transmission to a battery might be battery adjust, shell HE, charge 5, deflection 2850, quadrant elevation 312, 1 round. The battery received the data and immediately began preparing to fire. The executive officer, in charge of the firing battery, ensured each gun crew received the data. Gun crews set their sights to the specified deflection and elevation. Loaders prepared the correct ammunition, a high-explosive shell with the specified propellant charge. The battery commander ordered, "Battery adjust, number 1 piece, 1 round. Fire when ready." From the moment the forward observer made his initial call to the moment the first ranging round left the gun, as little as 2 minutes could elapse in a well-trained American artillery battalion. The ranging round allowed the forward observer to adjust fire. He would watch where the shell landed, estimate correction needed, and call back to the fire direction center. Write 5 to 0. Add 100. The fire direction center would transmit corrected data. The battery would fire again. Usually within 3 or 4 ranging rounds, the fire was on target. Once on target, the forward observer would call fire for effect. This was the signal for maximum fire. The fire direction center would order all batteries within range to fire. A battalion of 3 batteries, 12 guns total, would fire simultaneous volleys. Each gun crew would load and fire as fast as possible, usually achieving 4 rounds per minute sustained rate. In a typical fire for effect mission, each gun might fire 6 to 10 rounds before the forward observer called end of mission, target destroyed. The entire process, from initial call for fire to shells impacting the target, could be completed in 3 to 5 minutes for an experienced American artillery battalion. This was not theoretical. This was the standard American forward observers and fire direction centers achieved routinely in combat throughout the European theatre in 1944 and 45. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Counter-battery fire, the mission of destroying enemy artillery, received priority in American doctrine. When forward observers, aerial observers, or sound and flash ranging units detected enemy artillery firing, they immediately called fire missions. These missions were processed with maximum speed and assigned to multiple battalions simultaneously. The goal was to get steel on target before the enemy battery could displace. Sound and flash ranging deserves particular attention because it represented a technological advantage the Germans had not anticipated. American sound ranging units used arrays of microphones positioned at known locations across the battlefield. When enemy guns fired, the sound reached each microphone at slightly different times. By analyzing these time differences, trained specialists could calculate the location of the enemy guns with remarkable accuracy, usually within 50 to 100 meters. Flash ranging used similar principles but relied on visual observation. Observers at multiple positions would spot the muzzle flash from enemy guns. By triangulating these observations, they could plot the enemy battery location. Both systems worked best at night when sound carried farther and flashes were more visible. Both systems could provide targeting data to friendly artillery within 1 to 2 minutes of enemy guns firing. German artillery crews had no equivalent systems. German sound ranging equipment existed, but was less sophisticated and less widely deployed. German counter-battery procedures relied primarily on forward observers, spotting enemy gun positions, a slower and less reliable method. German fire direction procedures, while effective, were not optimized for the kind of rapid response the Americans had institutionalized. The result was a fundamental mismatch in counter-battery capability. When German guns fired, American sound and flash ranging units detected them immediately. Within 60 seconds, target coordinates were being transmitted to American fire direction centers. Within another 60 seconds, firing data was being transmitted to batteries. Within another 60 to 90 seconds, American shells were in the air. Total time from German guns firing to American shells, landing on that position, 3 to 4 minutes. German counter-battery procedures, by contrast, required forward observers to visually locate enemy guns, estimate their position, call back to fire direction centers using field telephones that were often disrupted by American artillery fire, wait for firing data to be calculated and transmitted, and then wait for German guns to lay on target and fire. The entire process rarely took less than 10 minutes, and often took significantly longer. Obergefreiter Weber, standing beside his leFH 18 on the morning of November 18, 1944, understood none of this technical detail. He only knew that American counter-battery fire was fast, terrifyingly fast, faster than anything German Doctrine had prepared crews to face. His battery had fired its mission. His watch showed 2 minutes 30 seconds. The guns were limbered. The prime movers were moving forward to hook up the guns. In another 30 seconds they would be pulling out of the firing position. Then he heard it. The sound was distinctive, a freight train roar growing louder, the sound of heavy shells passing overhead. But these shells were not passing overhead. They were incoming. The sound changed pitch as the shells descended. Weber's stomach clenched. He had heard that sound before, in Russia, but never this quickly after his own battery had fired. The first American shells landed in a pattern across the battery position. The forward observer who had called this fire mission had done his job well. The sound ranging unit had provided accurate coordinates. The American Fire Direction Center had processed the mission with practiced efficiency. 3 batteries of M101 Howitzers had fired simultaneous volleys. 36 14.97 kilogram high-explosive shells arrived within a 5-second span. Weber threw himself flat. The ground heaved. Explosions walked across the position, each shell creating a blast radius of approximately 30 meters, within which fragmentation was lethal. The carefully selected firing position, which German Doctrine said should be vacated within 5 to 7 minutes, was being saturated with high explosive before 3 minutes had elapsed. One of the 4 guns in Weber's battery took a direct hit. The shell struck the shield, penetrated, and detonated among the ready ammunition stored beside the gun. The leFH 18 disintegrated in a secondary explosion that threw fragments across the position. The crew, who had been preparing to mount the prime mover, were killed instantly. A second gun was caught by 3 shells landing within meters of each other. The overlapping blast fragmented the gun's trail, shredded the tires on its carriage, and killed or wounded the entire crew. The prime mover that had been approaching to hook up this gun was struck by shell fragments that punctured the engine block and killed the driver. The third gun's crew had managed to hook up their howitzer and were beginning to move when shells landed behind them. Fragments struck the half-track's rear compartment, killing 2 men riding in the back. The driver accelerated, pulling the gun away from the killing zone even as more shells landed around them. Weber's gun, the 4th in the battery, was already moving when the barrage began. His crew had mounted the prime mover seconds before the first shells landed. The driver, hearing the incoming rounds, accelerated without waiting for orders. The half-track pulled the howitzer out of the position at maximum speed, tracks throwing dirt, moving toward the pre-planned displacement route. Behind them, the battery position continued to receive fire. American artillery was not firing random harassing fire. This was a deliberate mission to destroy an identified target. The forward observer, watching through binoculars from his position with an American infantry company, could see the German firing position through breaks in the smoke. He adjusted fire. Right 5-0, add 5-0, repeat range. More shells arrived, walking across the position, ensuring total coverage. When the barrage lifted after approximately 2 minutes of sustained fire, the German battery position was a moonscape of overlapping craters. 2 guns were destroyed beyond repair. Equipment was scattered across the area. Ammunition that had been prepared for the mission. It was detonated or buried under dirt thrown up by explosions. 7 men were dead, 5 were wounded, some critically. The battery, which had consisted of 4 guns and approximately 40 men, was combat ineffective. Weber's gun and 1 other escaped. They reached an alternate position 3 kilometers away and went into hiding. Guns concealed under camouflage nets, crews waiting for orders that would not come until the shattered battery could be reconstituted with replacement guns and personnel. The entire engagement, from the moment Weber's battery fired its mission to the moment his gun reached safety, had lasted 7 minutes. American counter-battery fire had arrived in under 3 minutes. The battery had lost half its guns and nearly a quarter of its personnel. This was not an isolated incident. This was the pattern across the Western Front in the autumn and winter of 1944. German artillery batteries that fired missions found themselves under American counter-battery fire with a speed that German doctrine had never anticipated. Batteries that followed proper displacement procedures, moving within 5 to 7 minutes of firing, still took casualties. Batteries that delayed, that fired multiple missions from the same position, or that were slow to displace, were destroyed. German after-action reports from this period consistently noted the speed and accuracy of American artillery response. A report from the 716th Infantry Division in December 1944 stated, "Enemy artillery fire follows our own fire missions with a rapidity that suggests the enemy has prior knowledge of our gun positions. Displacement within 5 minutes of firing is no longer sufficient to avoid casualties. Batteries are instructed to displace within 3 minutes when possible." But 3 minutes was barely enough time to limber a gun and begin moving, let alone reach a safe position. The mathematics of survival had changed. German artillery doctrine, developed over years of combat experience, was suddenly inadequate. The enemy's capability exceeded what German planners had believed possible. Individual German artillerymen, men like Weber who survived multiple fire missions, developed their own survival techniques. Some batteries began firing only single rounds before displacing, sacrificing effectiveness for survival. Others fired from positions with immediate cover available, natural depressions or tree lines that crews could reach within seconds. Some batteries ceased firing altogether during daylight hours. When American observation aircraft and forward observers had better visibility, conducting fire missions only at night when displacement in darkness offered some protection. These adaptations helped, but could not eliminate the fundamental problem. American artillery could respond faster than German batteries could displace. The American system, built on abundant equipment, excellent communications, and doctrine that prioritized speed, had created a capability that German artillery could not match and could barely survive against. The psychological impact on German artillery crews was profound. Artillerymen had always faced danger, but traditionally from enemy counter-battery fire that arrived after they had displaced, or from air attack, or from enemy ground forces overrunning positions. The danger was manageable through proper tactics and alertness. But American counter-battery fire arrived so quickly that proper tactics were barely sufficient, and sometimes not sufficient at all. Crews developed fatalism. They knew that firing a mission meant accepting risk that displacement procedures might not eliminate. They fired because orders required it, because the infantry needed support, because their role in the German army was to provide artillery support, regardless of cost. But they harbored no illusions about their chances if American sound. Ranging units detected them. Captured German artillery officers, interrogated by American intelligence personnel, consistently expressed shock at American artillery capabilities. One battery commander, captured in December 1944 near Aachen, told interrogators, "We knew American artillery was numerous. We did not know it was so fast. Our doctrine calls for displacement within 5 minutes. Your counter-battery fire arrives in 3 minutes. This is not warfare. This is execution." The interrogator's report noted, subject appeared genuinely shaken by American artillery response times. He stated that in Russia, German batteries could fire and displace with confidence, that Soviet counter-battery fire would arrive too late. Against American forces, he stated, "No displacement procedure is fast enough." He expressed the belief that American artillery has access to detection methods German forces do not understand. This belief, that Americans possessed some unknown detection technology, was common among German troops. Some believed Americans had aircraft with special equipment that could see through camouflage. Others believed American artillery observers had electronic devices that detected gun flashes from extreme distances. The reality that American advantages came from sound ranging equipment, efficient fire direction procedures, and abundant artillery was less exotic but more devastating because it represented systematic superiority rather than a single technological secret that might be countered. The impact on German military effectiveness was substantial. Artillery is often called the king of battle, and with good reason. Artillery provides fire support for infantry attacks, breaks up enemy attacks, interdicts enemy movements, and destroys enemy fortifications. An army without effective artillery is severely handicapped. An army whose artillery cannot fire without suffering immediate counter-battery fire is in an impossible position. By late 1944, German artillery on the Western Front was increasingly ineffective. Batteries fired fewer missions, conserving ammunition and avoiding the risk of counter-battery fire. Fire support for German infantry attacks became spotty and inadequate. German defensive positions received less artillery support than Doctrine called for. The German army, which had begun the war with excellent artillery and well-developed fire support doctrine, found itself increasingly unable to employ its artillery effectively. American infantry units reported that German artillery fire, while still dangerous when it came, was less frequent and less sustained than in earlier campaigns. A report from the 1st Infantry Division in December 1944 noted, "Enemy artillery fire has decreased significantly compared to Normandy campaign. When enemy artillery does fire, it is typically limited to brief missions followed by rapid displacement. Enemy appears unwilling to sustain fire missions due to concern about counter-battery fire. The strategic implications were significant. Artillery had been central to German military success in the early war years. The careful coordination of artillery with armour and infantry, the Blitzkrieg methodology, required effective artillery support. German defensive doctrine similarly relied on artillery to break up enemy attacks and inflict casualties on attacking forces. When German artillery became ineffective, the entire German tactical system suffered. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 illustrated these problems. The German offensive, launched on December 16th, initially achieved surprise and made significant gains. German artillery supported the attack with heavy fire missions, using ammunition stockpiled specifically for this offensive. But as American forces recovered and counterattacked, American artillery dominated the battlefield. German batteries that fired in support of their infantry were quickly identified and destroyed by American counter-battery fire. Within days of the offensive's start, German artillery commanders were reporting unsustainable losses. Batteries were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced or reconstituted. Ammunition expenditure was higher than planned because batteries were firing brief, intense missions rather than sustained support, requiring more shells to achieve the same effect. By early January 1945, when the German offensive was finally halted, German artillery units in the Bulge salient had suffered catastrophic casualties. One German artillery regiment that entered the Bulge offensive with 36 guns emerged with 11 guns still operational and barely half its personnel. The regiment's war diary, captured later by American forces, documented the progressive destruction of batteries throughout the offensive. Entry after entry recorded the same pattern. Battery fire's mission, American counter-battery fire, arrives within 3 to 5 minutes. Battery suffers casualties. Surviving guns displaced to new position. After the war, American and German military historians analyzed the artillery performance of both sides. The consensus was clear. American artillery had been systematically superior in every measurable category. American guns were at least as good as German guns technically. American ammunition was more plentiful and of consistent quality. American fire direction procedures were faster and more efficient. American forward observers were better trained and equipped. American counter-battery capabilities were vastly superior. But the most important factor was systematic. The American military had built an artillery system, a comprehensive approach that integrated equipment, training, doctrine, communications, and logistics into a coherent whole. German artillery, while technically proficient, operated within a system that was less integrated, less well supplied, and ultimately less effective. The 3-minute window, the time German crews had after firing before American counter-battery fire arrived, became a symbol of this systematic disparity. It represented not a single technological advantage, but rather the cumulative effect of many American advantages. Sound-ranging equipment that detected firing within seconds, radio communications that transmitted targeting data without delay, fire direction centers that calculated firing solutions in under a minute, abundant ammunition that allowed immediate fire for effect, and guns positioned within range of every likely enemy artillery position. German veterans who survived the war and wrote memoirs or gave interviews consistently mentioned American artillery as one of the most devastating aspects of fighting on the Western Front. They described the psychological strain of knowing that any fire mission might be their last. They described the frustration of being unable to provide adequate support to their infantry because the risk of counter-battery fire was too high. They described watching experienced crews and valuable equipment destroyed in seconds by American fire that arrived impossibly fast. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber survived the war. His battery was never reconstituted to full strength after the losses in November 1944. He served with understrength artillery units through the winter, firing occasional missions and experiencing several more instances of devastating American counter-battery fire. In March 1945, his unit was overrun by American armor near Remagen. Weber was captured, spending the final months of the war in a prisoner of war camp. In interviews conducted decades later, Weber remembered the speed of American artillery as the defining characteristic of combat on the Western Front. He stated, "In Russia, we had time. We could fire and move and be safe. Against the Americans, there was never enough time. We would fire, and before we could move, their shells were already falling. It was not a matter of courage or training, it was simply impossible. Their artillery was faster than we could respond to." This testimony, echoed by hundreds of German veterans, confirms what the statistics and after-action reports demonstrate. American artillery in World War II achieved a level of systematic effectiveness that no other army matched. The speed of American counter-battery fire, arriving in 3 to 4 minutes from enemy guns firing, was not an accident or a lucky occurrence. It was the designed result of a military system built specifically to deliver rapid, massed artillery fires. The lessons learned from this experience shaped post-war artillery development. The United States military codified the procedures that had worked so well, refining them further. Fire direction procedures became even more standardized. Communications equipment became more reliable and more portable. Sound and flash ranging equipment became more accurate. The doctrine of massed fires, rapid response, and abundant ammunition remained central to American artillery through subsequent conflicts. German military analysis after the war acknowledged that German artillery doctrine had been inadequate for the realities of combat against American forces. Post-war German military writing emphasized the importance of rapid displacement, the need for redundant communications, and the value of detection equipment for counter-battery work. But the fundamental lesson was one of industrial capacity. Germany had fought enemies whose industrial production matched or exceeded German production. The result was inevitable. For the individual crews who served in German artillery batteries in 1944 and 45, the experience was one of progressive disillusionment. They had trained on equipment they believed was effective. They had learned tactics they believed were sound. They had entered combat with confidence in their abilities and their army. Then they encountered an enemy whose systematic advantages rendered German equipment and tactics inadequate. The 3 minutes they had after firing, before American shells arrived, became a countdown to survival. Some crews made it, many did not. The survivors remembered not the glory of battle but the helpless frustration of being outmatched by an enemy whose advantages were not dramatic individual superiority, but systematic, industrial, comprehensive superiority across every aspect of artillery warfare. This was the reality of industrial war between modern nations in the mid-20th century. Victory went not to the most courageous troops or the most brilliant tactics, but to the nation that could build the most effective military system, supply it with abundant resources, and employ it with systematic efficiency. American artillery in World War II was a nearly perfect example of this principle in action. German artillery, for all its technical competence and crew proficiency, could not overcome the systematic disadvantages under which it operated. The story of German artillery crews counting down 3 minutes after firing, knowing American counter-battery fire was already on the way, is a story about the limits of courage and skill when facing systematic industrial superiority. It is a story about how wars between modern nations are decided not by individual soldiers, but by the systems those soldiers operate within. And it is a reminder that in industrial warfare, the factory is as important as the battlefield, and the logistics system is as decisive as the frontline tactics. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.